He killed at least 12 people. He removed their heads. And he did it in America's 6th largest city during the height of the Great Depression, just miles from City Hall. For years, body parts appeared in rivers, empty lots, and roadside fields. The victims had no names. The killer left almost no clues. And the city lived in fear of a man the newspapers would call the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. But this case has one detail that makes it different from almost every other unsolved murder mystery in American history. The man hunting the killer wasn't an ordinary detective. It was Eliot Ness. The same Eliot Ness who helped bring down Al Capone, the legendary crime fighter behind the Untouchables. At the time, he was Cleveland's top law enforcement official, with the full power of the police, the support of the FBI, and resources most investigators could only dream of. And he failed. The killer kept killing. The bodies kept appearing. And despite one of the most famous manhunts in American history, nobody was ever charged. Then, nearly 90 years later, something changed. In 2024, investigators returned to unmarked graves outside Cleveland, searching for answers hidden beneath the earth for almost a century. New DNA technology may finally reveal the identities of victims who were forgotten by history. Which means this case isn't over. Because somewhere in the shadows of this mystery lies a question that has haunted investigators for generations. Did the Cleveland torso murderer really disappear? Or did he simply get away with it? Before we get into it, hit like on this video and subscribe if you're new here. We cover real cases and we only tell you what's actually been proven in court documents and reporting. Let's get into what happened. To understand this case, you have to understand the place. Kingsbury Run was a ravine that cut through the east side of Cleveland, a scar of dead space running from the edge of downtown out toward the suburbs, following old railroad lines down to the Cuyahoga River. By the early 1930s, in the depths of the Depression, it had become something else. A shantytown, a hobo jungle. Thousands of men rode the rails in and out of Cleveland looking for work that didn't exist, and a lot of them ended up camped in the Run, tents and shacks built out of scrap wood and tin. Fires burning at night, no addresses, no records, nobody keeping track of who came and went. Just east of the ravine sat an area locals called the Roaring Third. Bars, gambling dens, brothels. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear and no one would file a report, because no one was entirely sure that person had ever officially existed in the first place. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this case, because whoever did this understood it too. The case most researchers consider the killer's true first victim is a woman found on September 5th, 1934. Only the lower half of her torso washed up on the shore of Lake Erie, near Euclid Beach. No head, no arms. She was never identified. Investigators would later call her the Lady of the Lake. And for decades, her case sat in a kind of gray zone, sometimes counted among the torso murderer's victims, sometimes treated as a separate, unsolved case entirely. The murders that made headlines started just over a year later. On September 23, 1935, two teenage boys wandered into Kingsbury Run near a spot called Jackass Hill and found two bodies. Both men. Both decapitated, their heads found buried nearby. One of them was identified through fingerprints. Edward Andrassy, 29 years old, a former hospital orderly who'd had a handful of run-ins with police. He was one of only 3 victims in this entire case who would ever get a name back. The second man, found right beside him, was never identified at all. Both bodies had been drained of blood and washed clean. Whoever did this hadn't just killed these men, he'd taken his time. 4 months later, in January 1936, police found the dismembered body of a woman on Cleveland's east side, wrapped in newspaper and packed into half-bushel baskets. Her head was never found. She was eventually identified as Florence Polillo, 44 years old. She'd be the second of only 3 victims police were ever able to name. By the middle of 1936, Cleveland had a serial killer, and everyone in the city knew it. The victim who turned this from a local horror into a national story showed up in June 1936. 2 boys walking through Kingsbury Run on their way to go fishing found a pair of pants stuffed in a bush. They poked at it with their fishing poles, and a man's severed head rolled out. This victim was different. He was younger, well-groomed, clearly not a transient. Good clothes, no signs of the hard living the other victims showed. But he had 6 tattoos, including a woman's name, and detectives were sure someone would recognize him. They made a plaster cast of his head and displayed it, along with photos of his tattoos at the Great Lakes Exposition, a massive public event that drew over 100,000 visitors that year. Nobody ever identified him. To this day, he's known only as the Tattooed Man. Then on September 10th, 1936, a man trying to hop a train at East 37th Street tripped over half a human torso lying in a stagnant pool of water. Police searched the pool and pulled out the rest of the body in pieces. A crowd of over 600 people gathered to watch. Onlookers, reporters, curious residents, all standing at the edge of the water while divers worked the scene. The killer, if he was there, could have been standing in that crowd. Nobody would have known. The coroner examining these bodies kept noticing the same thing. Whoever was doing this knew exactly where to cut. No hesitation marks. Clean disarticulation at the joints. One investigator described a killing where the head had apparently been removed in a single stroke, meaning the victim died almost instantly, and whoever held the knife had done this kind of thing before, on purpose, with skill. The newspapers gave him a name that stuck: the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. By the time the killings escalated, Cleveland already had a local celebrity in charge of public safety, Eliot Ness. A few years earlier, Ness had been a prohibition agent in Chicago, leading a small, hand-picked team of incorruptible agents nicknamed the Untouchables in a campaign against Al Capone's bootlegging empire. His reputation, fair or not, was as the guy who didn't cut corners and didn't take bribes. In 1935, Cleveland's mayor brought him in as public safety director, putting him in charge of both the police and fire departments. Ness had real measurable success in that job. He cracked down on corrupt cops, went after organized crime, and helped make Cleveland one of the safest big cities in the country by certain measures. But here's the part that gets flattened in the retelling. For most of the torso murders, Ness's actual role was largely administrative. This wasn't Al Capone. This wasn't gambling or bootlegging. It was one person killing alone, leaving almost no trace. It didn't fit the kind of investigation Ness knew how to run, and by most accounts, he stayed fairly hands-off for the first few years of the case. That changed as the body count climbed and the public pressure became impossible to ignore. Detectives Peter Merillo and Martin Zalewski threw themselves into the case, eventually interviewing more than 1,000 people between them. Coroner Samuel Gerber convened what the newspapers called a torso clinic. Police, doctors, and psychiatrists in one room, trying to build what we'd now call a profile. Gerber's read was consistent. The killer had to have real anatomical knowledge. Maybe a doctor, maybe a surgeon. Ness got pulled in deeper, and that's when the case took its strangest turn. Acting on Gerber's theory, investigators started looking specifically at doctors, especially ones with histories of alcoholism or documented mental instability. That search led them to a man named Francis Sweeney. Sweeney was a World War I veteran who had worked as a battlefield medic, reportedly performing amputations under combat conditions. After the war, he became a surgeon at a Cleveland hospital, but lost the position due to severe alcoholism. He'd grown up near Kingsbury Run. He had the anatomical skill the coroner kept describing. And there were rumors, never confirmed, about his personal life that made investigators view him as an outsider, even within his own social circle. There was also a complication. Sweeney's first cousin was Martin L. Sweeney, a sitting U.S. congressman from Cleveland, and inconveniently for Ness, one of his loudest political critics, someone who'd been publicly hammering Ness in the press for failing to catch the killer. In 1938, Ness had Francis Sweeney brought in for questioning. Quietly off the books, held in a hotel room, according to accounts from people involved in the investigation. Before they could even begin, Sweeney was so intoxicated they had to hold him for 3 days just to sober him up. When the questioning finally happened, it reportedly went on for the better part of a week. Ness brought in Leonard Keeler, one of the actual inventors of the modern polygraph, to run the test personally. According to David Cowles, a Cleveland police official who worked closely with Ness and gave an interview decades later confirming these details, Sweeney failed not 1 but 2 polygraph examinations. Keeler was apparently unequivocal about it, telling Ness something to the effect that he might as well throw his machine out the window if this wasn't their man. Ness believed him. He was reportedly convinced Sweeney was the killer. But there was no physical evidence, no witness, no confession. By some accounts, Sweeney reportedly stood up during questioning, essentially daring Ness to prove it. And there was that cousin in Congress, watching Ness's every move, bringing formal charges against Sweeney with nothing but a polygraph result and no cooperating evidence against a man connected to a sitting congressman, wasn't something Ness felt he could make stick. Sweeney was released. Shortly after, he voluntarily committed himself to a veterans hospital, a status that, because he checked himself in, apparently gave him more freedom to come and go than you'd expect. He was formally diagnosed as a schizophrenic years later in 1956. He died in 1964. He was never charged with a single one of the murders. Starting in the early 1950s, more than a decade after the killings had stopped, Ness began receiving strange, rambling postcards. Some were signed with variations of Sweeney's name. They mocked Ness for never solving the case. They kept arriving for years. They only stopped after Ness died in 1957. The murders didn't stop because of Sweeney's interrogation. They stopped a few months later after something else entirely. On August 16, 1938, 2 more bodies were discovered at a lakefront dump site. A woman's torso, wrapped in a man's blazer and an old quilt, and near it, the dismembered remains of a man. What made this discovery different was the location. Both bodies were found within view of Eliot Ness's own office window at City Hall. Whether that was coincidence or a message, nobody knows. But it read like one. 2 days later, in the middle of the night, Ness assembled dozens of police officers and firefighters and led a raid directly into Kingsbury Run, shantytown. They evicted roughly 300 people, arrested dozens more on vagrancy-related charges, and burned the shacks to the ground. Ness's official justification was that this would let police fingerprint and catalog the transient population, making it easier to identify future victims and, in theory, flush out anyone connected to the killings. In practice, it looked exactly like what it was, a raid on the city's homeless population conducted by a desperate official under enormous public pressure with almost no realistic chance of catching anyone. It was, by most accounts, the single most controversial decision of Ness's career. And it worked in the narrowest possible sense. The murders attributed to the torso killer stopped, whether that was because of the raid, because of Sweeney's institutionalization, or because of nothing Ness did at all, is something historians still argue about. Ness's reputation never really recovered. He ran for mayor of Cleveland years later and lost badly. He died in 1957 at 54 years old, largely broke, having struggled with alcoholism himself in his final years. His memoir was published just months after his death and became the basis for the version of Eliot Ness. Most people know today the fedora, the Tommy gun, the incorruptible G-Man. That version leaves out Kingsbury Run almost entirely. Officially, the Cleveland torso murders are attributed to 12 victims between 1935 and 1938. Some researchers, including lead detective Peter Merylo himself, believed the real number was higher, that the same killer, or a closely related one, might be connected to similar dismemberment cases found along railroad lines in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in Ohio during the same years, since the rail network connecting those cities ran directly through Kingsbury Run. Of the 12 to 13 officially recognized victims, only 3 were ever identified: Edward Andrassy, Florence Polillo, and more tentatively, a woman named Rose Wallace. Everyone else, 6 men, 4 women, went into the ground with no name at all, buried in a potter's field, the kind of anonymous public burial reserved for people nobody claimed. For almost 90 years, that's where the story ended. Then in the summer of 2024, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with a nonprofit called the DNA Doe Project to try something that simply wasn't possible in 1938. Identify these victims through investigative genetic genealogy, the same category of technique that's cracked cold cases like the Golden State Killer. In August 2024, they began exhuming remains from unmarked graves, starting with the tattooed man and one other victim found in the 1938 lakefront discovery. As of the most recent public updates, those cases are still listed as pending. Exhuming and testing 90-year-old remains buried in a potter's field is exactly as difficult as it sounds, and researchers have been upfront that there's no guaranteed timeline or guaranteed outcome. But for the first time since the 1930s, there's a real active scientific effort underway to give these people their names back. The killer will almost certainly never face justice, but the victims might finally stop being nameless. Whoever the mad butcher of Kingsbury Run really was, they picked their victims with something close to precision. People the world had already stopped looking for. That, as much as the knife, is what let this go unsolved for 90 years. If new DNA results come back and give names to any of these victims, we'll be covering it. If you want to see that update the moment it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is a case we're going to keep following. And if this kind of deep dive, fact-checked true crime history is what you're here for, there's another case just like it waiting for you right now.